Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this important webinar on theology, churches, and the mainstreaming of the far right. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be an urgent and challenging discussion. We're meeting at a time when far-right movements across Europe and the UK are increasingly appropriating Christian language, imagery, and symbols to legitimize exclusionary nationalist agendas. Crosses and crusader flags appear at rallies. Biblical texts are selectively quoted to justify xenophobia, and Christian identity is being redefined as a marker of ethnic and cultural purity rather than a sign of radical hospitality and grace. This development exposes a profound contradiction at the heart of contemporary British Christianity. How can faith grounded in the universality of God's love, the inclusion of the stranger, and the compassion of Christ be used to promote division and fear? The mainstreaming of the far right poses difficult questions for churches and theologians alike. It calls us to reassert that the gospel of Jesus Christ cannot be reduced to nationalism, and that Christian theology, at its best, embodies the countercultural values of justice, welcome, and reconciliation. It also forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that some churches, wittingly or not, have provided the theological cover for exclusion while others have remained silent. An especially with my screen here, an especially striking feature of the current moment is the visible presence of some Black Christians aligning with right-wing populist movements. This emerging alliance raises new and complex questions about race, belonging, and power in Christian political engagement, demanding careful theological and sociological scrutiny. Tonight, we are privileged to have four distinguished speakers. Dr. Aaron Winter will open with an overview of the far right in the UK today. Dr. CHRIS SHANNAHAN will then explore theological responses. Dr. KRISH KANDIAH will offer an ecumenical perspective through a recorded interview, and Dr. CAROL TOMLIN will reflect on Black Pentecostal responses. After the presentation, we'll open the floor for a short discussion and at least 30 minutes of questions. So please feel free to post your thoughts and questions in the chat as we proceed. Thank you. And let's begin with Dr. Aaron Winter.
Thank you very much. First, I want to say thank you to Robert for the invitation and opportunity to share the panel and discuss this important topic with all of you. Second, I want to note, just for the record, while religion and theology are not my research focus or expertise, they actually have been in the past. In fact, my first piece of research on the far right was an honors dissertation on eschatological thought and right-wing rhetoric. My PhD was on the shift from mainstream Protestantism to more radical and racist theologies like Christian identity, and as well as Odinism on the American far right. I've worked on anti-abortion politics and activism, and currently working on both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, as well as the role of new atheism in the mainstreaming of the far right. And today I kind of want to start with that and come back around to the role of religion. But tonight, though, I want to focus mostly on the mainstreaming of the far right in the current moment, in the current context. But we'll also touch at the end on some of the ways and places that religion and theology come into play in both mainstreaming of the far right and opposition to it, quite importantly. After years of political, media, and academic neglect, as well as racism, the far right has been growing in size and influence over the past decade and is now unavoidable as a focus of attention, particularly in light of last summer's riots and this year's flags, rallies, and what have been called euphemistically protests here in England and across Britain, as well as far-right electoral gains with Reform UK and their ideas about migrants and legitimate concerns, also in the hands of Starmer's Labour Party trying to beat them at their own game. We see the rise of the far right and mainstreaming in Italy, Hungary, France, Germany, Argentina, and the United States with the re-election of Trump, which was acknowledged with not only a few Nazi salutes, but increasingly fascist executive orders, federal law, border enforcement mobilizations, deportations, and disappearances. This has confirmed how mainstreamed and emboldened and significant the far right are. This is something that has largely happened through the lens of Islamophobia and the issue of migration. Now, I want to outline how I think we got here, and why the current dominant approach to defeating the far right is in danger of often repeating the mistakes of the past. There are, of course, a lot of factors and mechanisms involved in the mainstreaming of the far right, many of which I've examined in my research, including media platforming, economic and political crises that have required, allegedly, a great amount of distraction and scapegoats. But I want to capture these kind of factors through two specific frameworks or narratives that I would argue have done much of the heavy lifting. The first is what I call in my work with Aurélien Mondon, liberalism versus illiberalism. This is the sort of liberal democratic focus on the extreme and the exceptional, that is the far right, as a proxy for unacceptable racism that is widely seen as out of place and out of time in our, lovely post-racial liberal democratic societies, in ways that represent racism only in the extreme forms it takes. This allows our system and our establishment to deny mainstream structural and systemic racism. The concept of liberal racism refers to articulations of racism denial that distinguish themselves by asserting they are not real racism, like, the Nazis, the Klan, Oswald Mosley, the National Front, or contemporary far right. And they also, in ways that they sell our democracies through this narrative of progress, how we defeated it, and how democracy is the best system to defend against it. But what ends up happening with this is that the far right is often used as a foil to defend the liberal status quo, and more moderate liberal racist positions and policies that appear acceptable in comparison and are deemed necessary to fight the far right. So what we often see is the framing of the far right as a justification for being tougher on immigration, strengthening our borders. We saw this most acutely in 2018 when Hillary Clinton wrote in The Guardian that Europe needs to curb immigration to stop right-wing populists. We see something similar when the Tories and Labour in the last election went after each other who could be tougher on small votes, as if there was no other constituency, strategy, or politics to pursue, including addressing deep-seated inequalities. I'm not sure in that sense why any of them oppose the far right. It cannot possibly be because of the far right's position on racism or immigration. And by doing it this way, by framing the threat of the far right as something which threatens democracy more than it threatens any community at the sharp end of racism, they've legitimized increasingly further and further right-wing, far-right ideas. And what we've seen through this strategy, as well as others, is the increasing mainstreaming and emboldening of the far right. We also see liberalism used to justify other forms of racism, liberal racism and against Muslims and migrants who are seen as intolerant or themselves illiberal, a threat to LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights, and free speech. We see the way in which even the language of something like prevent, which is designed to counter extremism for all its problems, actually is the language of our fundamental British values, are used by the far right. The framing as well in terms of liberal values is the idea of free speech, which has seen the far right increasingly platformed on mainstream public television as well as privately owned. And they're often platformed under the slightly contradictory logic that you need to give them the time in order to represent democracy in all its diversity, which is quite ironic, or to defeat them by exposing their bad ideas, the disinfectant of sunlight. Well, that we know the latter has completely failed. What has succeeded is giving equal and democratic representation to far-right ideas and to racism and other forms of hate, has actually seen these movements grow and these ideas become increasingly mainstream. But what the key to this is the democratic. And the reason I would argue that is because the second narrative or framework through which the far right has been mainstreamed is the idea that far right ideas, support for the far right and racism, as well as the riots, Trump, Brexit, are an expression of the legitimate concerns of the people, and the people often narrowly defined as the white working class left behind. And this is seen as an underrepresented constituency that becomes justification for what effectively are white grievance narratives and giving the far right time. This has only worked, but it's become a truism in politics, the media, and academia. How often do we hear this rhetoric repeated? Yet it is strongly contested. It is wrong. Racism is not the sole purview of the working class, and nor are the working class white. But it's also classist. It sees the working class in inherently negative terms. And what is really important about this is it often slips between a representation of the far right, of the working class, as far right and potentially extremist, but also those people who are clinging to tradition, heritage, and our symbols. And this is constantly repeated as if to sort of normalize these ideologies and make them part of the fabric of Britishness and working class consciousness. These are inherently problematic because what often happens is the appeal to working class left behind representation is not one that addresses socioeconomic inequality, one that is shared across all racial groups and disproportionately amongst those who are racialized or migratized, but does nothing for the class position and jobs or well-being of working class people, including those who they claim are racist. Now, what is interesting about this is what I've said is the far right sometimes is exceptionalized as an extreme and the embodiment of racism in our society, or a democratic will of the people. Now, this may appear contradictory, but it's only contradictory insofar that you don't see the way in which both narratives allow the system to reproduce and maintain and solidify the social, political, economic, and I would say racial and national status quo. We saw this contradicted as well in the 2024 riots, where we saw sometimes that they were being called sort of in very terrible classist language. They're mobs and yobs and morons, lawlessness, criminality, extremism, terrorism. And then others were calling them the expression of legitimate concerns of ordinary people. And this is how we see the way in which this contradiction both serves the interests of those ideas. It can exceptionalize and individualize some, but actually legitimizes and normalizes the entire, the cause around flags, the cause along the nation and its heritage, the cause to protect women and girls from attacks victimization, although in this case, only by migrants and those who are migratized or racialized. This is very significant because we see in this the way in which symbols that we all can see around us, and traditions that we all see around us can be not necessarily co-opted, but their co-option can be flattened out, can help whitewash or flatten out extremism and racism. We see that the flags, something so exceptional over the top, riots and mass mobilizations, tied to something that is so common sense and commonplace. It is heritage, identity, and common sense to some, scary, racist, and fascist to others. It's sometimes what's going on is against the law, like vandalism, and sometimes it is allowed, and both can occur. It forces many of us to explain what we think is wrong with flying the flag in your own country. What is it wrong with wanting to unite the kingdom? What is wrong with wanting to protect women and girls from grooming and assault? Making those of us who want to challenge this increasing racism and fascism, or support migrants, look like we either don't care, we hate Britain, or worse. And this takes us really to the issue of religion. And I want to say just a couple of points about this. Religion, as well as theology and churches, have long played a role in far-right identities and discourses. The Ku Klux Klan represented itself as a Christian organization, particularly in its second era when it opposed immigrants, communists, Jews, and Catholics. There are also many ways that religion has come into play. This can be, the UK is a traditional Christian country. The US, the Republican base, a refuge for those experiencing and escaping religious persecution. One nation under God from the Cold War, colonialism, and manifest destiny. We see Christian nationalism, American and globally, including recently news of King's Army marching through Soho. The culture wars, where we see secularists and new atheists join up with the religious against wokeness. We see the way in which Christianity is evoked against Muslims. We see the way in which religion comes into play with the construction of the Judeo-Christian in Islamophobic discourses. We see it in the place of anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, the colonial and civilizational language of Christian Western European civilizationist thought. So there we see the relationship between the national and the almost universal in far-right global movements. We see the meeting of the apocalyptic millenarian thought with accelerationism and race war narratives. But essentially what we see is the whitewashing of hate, exclusion through religion and dominant or historical cultural institutions, such as flags, patriotism, and again, religion. Now, we recently saw after Unite the Right rally, a group of bishops and Christian leaders wrote, "We are deeply concerned about the co-opting of Christian symbols, particularly the cross, during the rally. Jesus calls us to love both our neighbors and our enemies and welcome the stranger. Any co-opting or corrupting of the Christian faith to exclude others is unacceptable." And this line was signed by many. I don't typically use the argument of co-opting or appropriating or otherwise. One, because I may not belong to that faith or that community, and I can't necessarily speak for it authoritatively. But I also have trouble with talking about appropriation or co-option of traditional national cultural material, which has, due to the complex, even colonial and nationalist history of many of these, as well as the ability and right for people to interpret things. But I think it's important when not just a fringe movement co-ops, which can be easily dismissed, but when the dominant culture is and the dominant systems of power and institutions are sharing in the whitewashing of that by appeals to the flag, the cross, the church, and our national heritage in ways that actually harm people. And in that sense, I think opposition is absolutely necessary from churches, those whose identities, affiliations, and identifications and beliefs are not only weaponized against people, but parroted and pandered by those in power. I think it's important for churches, charities, NGOs, MPs, party members, as well as anti-racist and anti-fascist and communities to stand up against what is alleged to be the will of the people. And I will end it there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Winter, for providing us with that fascinating overview of the far right and the particular components of its thought. We move on next to our next presentation, which is a theological response from Dr. CHRIS SHANNAHAN. Chris.
Thanks very much indeed, Robert, for the invitation. It's great to see so many people here this evening, part of this important conversation. And in the interest of time, I want to share some brief reflections. The recent rise of Reform UK, the fear-inducing xenophobia of streets lined with the flag of St. George, the hate speech masquerading as righteous struggle, and the co-option of the cross and the Lord's Prayer pollute public discourse, bolster structural injustice, foster racialized exclusion, and wound our brothers, our sisters, our mothers, our fathers, and our children. Christian narratives have been weaponized and used to bolster ethnocentric nationalism and justify the demonizing of diversity and all of us who celebrate and defend it. What then can theology say into this critical situation? Well, I believe that this is a kairos context, that this is the kairos context in which we're called to do theology in the UK and beyond in 2025, a moment of judgment, but also opportunity. Cornel West argued that academics are called to shine a light on the suffering that dominant forces within society keep hidden. And the pioneer of Latin American liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, called all theologians to become what he referred to as organic intellectuals, borrowing language from Antonio Gramsci, people who are active participants in the struggle for liberation and justice. I agree. We need to make it crystal clear. As theologians, we are not neutral bystanders. For if we are, in inverted commas, neutral, we collude with a situation of systemic injustice and structural racism. In the face of such structural injustice and systemic racism, the only theology that matters is a politically engaged theology of liberation. If theology is not a force for liberative change, then it's not worth a moment of our time, and we might as well log off this evening and do something else. A truly liberative theological engagement with the appropriation of Christian symbols by the far right needs to name the xenophobia that drives such cultural violence. However, articulate, righteous indignation in a pulpit or a paper will not subvert the normalization of racist discourse. We need to avoid grandiose rhetoric if we want to get to grips with the systemic sin that we face. We need to ask uncomfortable questions and wrestle honestly with what we hear, rather than filtering out or ignoring or spiritualizing answers that make our blood boil. Anthony Pinn talks about the need to wrestle honestly with the messy, contradictory pain of oppression, to develop what he refers to as a nitty-gritty reflection on pain and anger and unresolved pain and unresolved suffering without pretending to have easy and slick, happy ever after answers. We need to draw on such a nitty-gritty hermeneutics if we're to avoid superficial stereotyping, spiritualizing, or theological tub thumping. So let's be honest as we challenge white supremacism, Christian nationalism, and the far right. Historically, the church has played its own dishonourable part in rejecting, ignoring, dismissing, and demonising the stranger, forgetting perhaps the reminder in Hebrews 13 that when we welcome the stranger, we welcome God's angels. And while we're at it, let's move beyond an understandable knee-jerk response to the Christian tropes appropriated by the far right. Let's move beyond unthinking condemnation, because only by moving beyond unthinking condemnation can we understand, and only through understanding can we move towards liberation. Such understanding can only emerge if we listen to the uncomfortable, systemic, brutal racism that we encounter. Do we hear anger as we listen? Do we sense a feeling of impotence, a feeling of cultural confusion or abandonment by political elites? What purpose does the far right's use of the cross, the Lord's Prayer, or its insistence that, quote, this is a Christian country, serve? Systemic racism can only be defeated when we dare to move beyond sound bites to serious, critical engagement and critical self-reflection. So in the interest of time, let me share just one or two thoughts and then one or two ideas for action. First, the God of creation who lives within each one of us shapes us all in the divine image. Consequently, Christian nationalism is a contradiction in terms, because ours is an internationalist God. Made in the image of God, the asylum seeker, risking her life in a leaky boat to flee from persecution, is not only a child of God, she is closer to the God who stands in solidarity with all who are oppressed than any flag-waving Christian nationalist. She is a herald of the gospel. Second, this internationalist God becomes our brother as the Word becomes flesh and lives with us. Too often, the incarnation is spiritualized and individualized, but this is revolutionary stuff. God in solidarity with oppressed, demonized, excluded humanity. Sounds grand, but what does that mean in the face of street violence and rising levels of racist violence and demonizing public discourse? 50 years ago, the pioneer of Black liberation theology in the United States, James Cone, in his iconic book, God of the Oppressed, hinted at an answer to that question, as he argued that because Jesus was an oppressed Jew in first century Palestine, he must necessarily be Black in contemporary America. Who, therefore, might Jesus be for us? Who might the Jesus who is in solidarity with the demonized and the oppressed be in 2025 in the UK? Third, last week, Tory politician Robert Jenrick told journalists that he felt uncomfortable in Handsworth because, he claimed, he didn't see many white faces. The lack of integration and self-segregation that Jenrick and others bemoan is common, let's be honest, but it's found in white majority suburbs, small towns and villages. It's not found in places like Handsworth, the rest of inner city Birmingham, or other urban communities. The far right fear difference and demonize diversity. Their appropriation of Christian symbols and alignment of Christianity with white Britishness, in inverted commas, and an unchanging, introverted, culturalist vision of identity may connect with people's need for meaning in a fragmented age. but also reflects an ideologically warped nationalistic reading of an internationalist gospel. Fourth, the vision promoted by the far right echoes similar culturalist appropriations of Christian teaching in other times and places. We might think of the German Christian sect in Nazi Germany, or the Dutch Reformed Church in apartheid South Africa, or white supremacists, Christian nationalists in the USA, and in the Trump White House. The gospel becomes a ring-fenced affirmation of the culture of the included, the powerful, the white. All scapegoat so-called strangers. In their vision of a culture-affirming racialized church, the far right frame diversity as a danger to unity, a threat to social cohesion. Truth, meaning, salvation are only found within ideologically constructed borders. Difference subverts the sacrosanct nature of such exclusionary borders. It's vital that we say again and again that diversity is not just good, it's a gift from God. Fifth, far-right activists like Tommy Robinson and Nigel Farage promote themselves as, quotes, men of the people. They rail against so-called elites and imply a concern for social cohesion and the common good. But nothing could be further from the truth. But rather than simply ignoring or dismissing or condemning, it's vital for theologians to engage critically with the substance of the corrosive narrative of the far right, the racialized and racist vision of the common good they promote, and their misappropriation of Christian symbolism and teaching. As theologians, we need, as a matter of urgency, to reframe and reassert the diverse unity of humanity. One race, the human race. The Church's commitment to God's preferential option for the poor. The Church is calling to transform structural injustice, the need to displace the cultural violence of systemic racism with a new liberative conscience. And so finally, in brief, 4 things we can commit ourselves to do. Number 1, publicly denounce all forms of Christian nationalism and white supremacism as forms of cultural violence and blasphemous perversions of the gospel. 2, speak out against all forms of nationalism, the excluding violence of flags on the street and in church, and the hegemonic political discourse that demonizes diversity and all perceived to be strangers. 3, to reimagine Jesus' beatitudes by consciously and proactively prioritizing the stranger and fashioning a series of what we might call liberative reversals that overturn unjust power relations. And 4th, we can model Jesus' prioritizing of marginalized groups such as the Samaritans in the Gospels into a 21st century context. At this Kairos moment, we're called to center the experience and reaffirm the value of the excluded, demonized stranger and their closeness to God if we're serious about countering the threat of the far right in 2025. It's time to get up. It's time to stand up. It's time to walk the walk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shanahan, for that engaging and thoughtful reflection, particularly intrigued by the 4 points at the end that you provide in terms of practical action going forward. We're now moving to our third presentation, which is a recorded presentation by Dr. KRISH KANDIAH. Chris wanted to be with us, but had to make a trip overseas, but has graciously provided us with a 10-minute presentation, the presentation that he would have liked to have given this evening. So just bear with us for a couple of minutes while we set up that recording.
I think the conversation we're having today is really important, and I've got a few views on why we've seen a mainstreaming of the far right within the Christian church. What's happened there? And I think there have been a number of different factors to that, and I want to unpack them for you. The first, I think, is that there is a nostalgia for Christendom a time when Christians were running things because they were Christians. You can go all the way back to the era of Constantine, how he was conquering the world in the name of Jesus under the banner of the cross. The cross was emblazoned on the shields of his soldiers. And this idea that Christianity was somehow endorsing imperial colonial power has been problematic for centuries. But in an increasingly secularized moment, the church and many within the kind of cultural Christian halo are missing that. They're missing the power the church once had. So nostalgia for what used to be, nostalgia when Christian values were assumed to be the norm. And again, that nostalgia may be mistaken. There may never have been a golden era. There may never have been a problem and a problem-free engagement with the church and the state, but there's still a nostalgia for it. You see that nostalgia in MAGA Christianity, Make America Great Again. In other words, going back to a time when things were better, when there were traditional values, when people say you could say what you want. It wasn't controversial to hold views around, I guess, let's say, a Christian moral ethic. And so there's nostalgia for that that draws many people into the realm of the far right. I think the other thing we're seeing is disgust from the left towards Christianity. That's not universal, but there's enough of it. You saw it maybe, for example, in the UK with the debate around assisted dying, that people said, well, just don't bring your Christian views into the public sphere. And so there is a pushing away for many Christians, particularly of the evangelical flavour, away from the left, because Christians are seen to be somehow out of step, backward, compared to the kind of progressive ethics of the left. And in months even, two particular issues have been quite powerful. One is the assisted dying bill, and the other is the decriminalisation for the mother of late-term abortion. And for many Christians, this is really important, and so it pushes them away from the left. While the right, on the other hand, are welcoming with open arms the Christian faith. I think the other thing we've got, and it's linked to that nostalgia, it's linked to that open arms, is the allure of power. It's almost irresistible. You might remember J.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. The ring of power began to corrupt those around it. And I see that as well, that if there's a route to power, people will do the deal. They'll kind of trash some really mainstream Christian values in order to get access to power. You've seen that in the US, you're seeing that here in the UK. You're seeing defections, for example, from the Conservative Party towards reform because it's a route to power. And I think the final reason I'm seeing is people are doing a trade deal with the culture war. And they say, okay, I don't agree with everything about what's going on with the right wing, but on the issues that I care about, and for many evangelicals in particular, those issues relate to life and sex, whether that's euthanasia, abortion, sexuality and gender. Those are the issues that really excite a lot of evangelical Christians, and so they do the deal. They say, well, you know, I'm not fully on board, I don't like Nigel Farage. In America, they used to call it holding their nose and voting for Trump. But what I've noticed is that kind of trade deal becomes self-confirming. Those people that did vote for Trump then enter into a more kind of full-blooded support of Donald Trump. And we see that happening, I think, within the UK church too, that the necessary trade deal is made, and then it becomes full-throated support for reform and the further right. And again, that's hugely problematic for me. It means the church is being played. We're a pawn in the culture war rather than a prophetic voice, which I think we've got to be and we need to rediscover. I mean, there have been some tipping points recently where I've seen this kind of come to the fore. So one would be the Charlie Kirk death. Many people didn't know who Charlie Kirk was, or if they did, maybe they saw a video about him debating on a university campus about abortion or gun control, but he had a strongly evangelical background. He argued that he was doing it in the name of Jesus, and after his assassination, his killing, it gets rebranded as a martyr, that he's someone preaching the gospel, and they almost make it impossible to critique Charlie Kirk. But when we saw at his memorial, CHRIS Tomlin, Carrie Joe, and some of the other kind of mainstream worship leaders, that was a normalization for the church, because many churches from within the evangelical and charismatic and Pentecostal stream, those are their songbook. To see Phil Wickham on a stage singing worship in the build-up to not just a memorial service for Charlie Kirk, but a political rally in which the President of the United States stands up and claims Charlie Kirk as one of his own, something changed. I think there are three areas of the church which face an important challenge right now. So one, I think, is the left-hand side, the kind of more progressive side of the church. The left-hand side of the church really captures some of the vital teaching the Bible has to say about justice, about kindness, about compassion. That has been their forte for so long, and it's so needed to be held onto and rediscovered for our moment. I think there is a right wing of the church that is concerned about conserving traditional teachings of the Bible, let's say, around sexuality and life issues. And I think they're important too. I don't think you have to choose between kindness and compassion and speaking up around issues of life and sexuality. I think you can hold those two things in tension. But for the left, the ugliness of the right might push them further left, further away from some of the traditional teachings of the Bible. And for the right, the fear that's being generated around the left wing is so scary that it's pushing them more towards the right, more towards the mainstreaming of those hard right policies. But there's a huge middle bump. And for many churches, they're just not engaging with this at all. They're nervous, the pastors, of bringing something up that's controversial, might get them in trouble with the congregation, might lose them members, might lose them finance. And at a time of great financial insecurity, that is very scary. And so there is silence, there's a vacuum. And when there's a vacuum, someone else comes in to fill it. And I think that's happening. I think people are being discipled less by their church leaders and more by online influencers or online media. And the right in particular has a hugely powerful media empire, funded generously. You've got people that fund GB News that claim Christian heritage. You've got the owner of The Spectator, The Telegraph, the same person actually that was one of the people behind GB News, hugely influential financially across the evangelical world. And so that media machine is filling in the vacuum left by many pastors, and therefore I think there is an increasing surge to the right. So what can we do? What is the way forward? Well, I want to suggest three ways I think we need to engage. The first is we need to tell a better story. And people have been using that phrase over and over again, and often they don't tell many stories at all. But at the moment, there is a story of fear that is gripping our culture. Again, I see it all the time in the hard right media. And it's fear that the left wing are destroying our great country and its tradition and its heritage. You saw that, for example, in the outrage there was about the stickers that went up on the inside of Canterbury Cathedral. People saying, look what the woke left are doing, they're destroying our culture. And there's fear there. But there's also fear about immigration, and people use words like invasion, that all these foreigners are coming over here and they're destroying our Judeo-Christian heritage. And so that fear that in a time of economic hardship, in a time of many social problems in our culture, looking for a scapegoat, someone to blame on the left, the woke group, or someone to blame who's an outsider coming in the immigrants. And again, I'm here in Germany where that playbook was used very effectively in the 1930s. And it wasn't immigrants that were targeted, it was Jewish people. And it wasn't the woke left that was targeted, it was communists. And that double whammy, that kind of hard right playbook is being reutilized again in our time. And I think we've got to tell a better story, a Christian story that doesn't belong to the left or the right, but one that belongs to the gospel. And I saw that taking place in the civil rights movement in America, where Martin Luther King, for example, obviously didn't buy into the zero-sum game of white supremacy, that whites need to win and blacks need to lose. But he also didn't give in to the mindset of the Black Power movement, where black people win and white people need to lose. When Martin Luther King gave his speech in Washington, D.C., in front of the Lincoln Memorial, he painted a better picture of America, told a better story of America. He said, I want to see my children and your children walking hand in hand, enjoying freedom together, everybody flourishing. I think that story is one that we need to tell, and it will help us in a culture of fear, a story of hope. I think we've also got to lean into the scriptures. Whether you like it or not, people on the right and people on the left both claim scripture as their source. But I think that the Bible is so powerful. It's God's word. It's like this double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. It doesn't fit neatly into a left-wing or a right-wing ideology. It challenges all of us. So I think close attention to scripture and allowing God to speak and cut through all of the ideology and call us all to repentance, faith and hope and compassion is what's needed. And finally, I think we need a coalition of the compassionate. What I'm noticing, particularly about the right, is they're very well financed, but they're also a big tent. People that shouldn't get on with each other are finding common cause, partly because they see it as a route to power. While the centre and the left, both in the culture and in the church, we end up fighting each other. So you saw it with your party. Do you remember Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn? They fell out with each other over, how the sign-ups were going to happen. And the world just said, well, of course, this is the way the left works. And I'm seeing that here in Europe and the UK too, that the left, we just don't know how to organise together, how to work together. We fall out about whether you're right on the right issues, and we've got to transcend that. We've got to offer a picture of unity and compassion. So I think we need a coalition of the compassionate. I'm so sorry I can't hear the questions that are going to come up, but I hope this contribution will help, and I look forward to hearing the outcome of your discussion. We really need to find a way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kandiah. It's a shame you couldn't be with us, but we will forward the questions once we get to the discussion phase. We have our final contribution this evening from Dr. Carol Tomlin, after which we will take questions from the chat. So please feel free to post questions as we go along. Dr. Tomlin.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Robert, for the invitation to participate in this important discussion. I cannot stress it enough how important this discussion is. And I am going to focus on the Black Pentecostal Church, or the Black Church. Before I begin, I want to briefly explain the meaning of the terms the Black Church or Black Majority Church or the Black Pentecostal Church, which are highly contested. We know there is only one universal church. However, according to Jemar Tisby, there would be no Black church without racism in the white church. So the Black church is a descriptor for the makeup of a congregation, and it is not monolithic, but I am really going to be focusing on the Black Pentecostal element of that segment. Our Prof. Beckford explains some of its hallmark in terms of radical transformation through a conversion experience. You'll find church mothers, deacons, soulful music, etc. One of the hallmarks of the Black Pentecostal Church as well is the adherence to orthodoxy and holiness. So this talk will reject the mainstreaming of the far-right ideologies by turning to the pages of the biblical text to highlight the kingdom hermeneutics of love as a centerpiece. It will explore how BMCs, or Black majority churches, can be a model for the kingdom message. And I'm so glad that my colleagues actually made reference to the Bible, but I want to specifically focus on key biblical texts. So firstly, let us turn to the biblical text, or the biblical texts on love and justice. Let us love one another. 1 John 4, verse 7. And I'm actually going to quote chapter and verse. The antithesis of hate and the hallmark of the kingdom message of Jesus Christ. Love covers a multitude of sins, but it is not blind. It rejoices in the truth and by extension, not lies. The Western Church at points in its torrid history colluded and compromised the core kingdom message of love and inadvertently chose hatred. Now, in some quarters, the church of all nationalities is participating in a far-right program centered on bigotry, selfishness, and hatred. As followers of Christ, true love is linked to justice, doing the right thing, not injustice. Amos 5:24 states, "Let justice run down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." And most of us are familiar with Micah 6:8, which tells us that we should be just and walk humbly before our God. Secondly, let us focus on the sin of racism rooted in hatred. I've actually written a book about this, Managing Everyday Racism, Sophisticated and Everyday Racism, with myself and Dr. Victoria Shuum-Numi. Worth getting a hold of that book to really explore the concepts of racism. Scholars such as Heidi Mirza argue that there are many forms of racisms, and she actually pluralized the word racism to racisms, manifested in anti-travelers, anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant or xenophobic, anti-Africanism or anti-Blackness tropes. It is a sin manifested in skin. Let me say that again. It is a sin manifested in skin and based on a color-coded pyramid system. The Western Church was given ample opportunity to reject the pseudo-scientific explanation of race and racism by invoking Genesis 1:26, that everyone is made in the imago Dei. I love that. The imago Dei, the image of God. Being a Christian minister should not entail ignoring the sin of racism. We must pay attention to the fears and hostilities that our Black congregants experience, or congregants, people of color, or of the global majority church. The microaggressions in our workplaces, our children's experiences of covert racism and sometimes overt in the playground, and the onslaught of the anti-Blackness embedded in the fabric of white society. The Rivers of Blood speech by Enoch Powell evokes painful memories for some of us. I still remember that particular speech. Therefore, the Unite the Kingdom rally means that we must put the song Kumbaya on the back burner, put it to one side for the time being. True Christianity is acknowledging our suffering and humanity and taking it to the cross. Finally, let us turn to the biblical text, be not unequally yoked. 2 Corinthians 6 verse 14. And I know this scripture is often used in relation to relationships, and especially in Black Pentecostal churches, it's used to explain about being unequally yoked or not marrying somebody who doesn't share one's Christian beliefs. Obviously, there's a wider context and a wider application of this particular text. It is a great pity that so many Christians, including leaders, diluted the supremacy of Christ by joining the Unite the Kingdom rally of the far-right movement. It is a great pity that some of my fellow Christians did not heed the calls of Jesus to love the stranger, Matthew 25, but have been seduced and bewitched by a patriotic and nationalistic narrative. It is a great pity that many have unwittingly listened to the mumbo-jumbo calls for violence expressed at the Unite the Kingdom rally. Some Christians became bedfellows with a far-right agenda of hatred instead of being countercultural and coming out from among them and being separate. As Corinthians 6 verse 14 says, what fellowship has light with darkness? After all, the Windrush generation would rightly say light and darkness cannot mix. If it coexists, the consequences for individuals will be cognitive dissonance. So what lessons can we learn from the Black church? We can all learn from Christians of African heritage. Many have gone through incredible trauma, including my 92-year-old mother who recently passed. I've got a quote from an American sister who doesn't look like me, by the way. And she stated, "It is amazing to me that people who went through so much pain and trauma, who had the Bible weaponized against them, could still choose the Christ of Scripture. Black people understood what it meant to separate the false religion of their oppressors from the true gospel of Jesus Christ. They knew the difference between what slave masters twisted for control and what the word of God actually says, to love one another, to live free, to walk in liberty. For people to go through all that and still cling to Jesus is outstanding and astounding. It shows us the power of real faith. It shows us that the Christ of the Bible cannot be changed, cannot be corrupted, and cannot be stolen by systems of oppression. This is the kingdom message, and the Black church still challenges us with this message today. And this is the message that Christians need to reclaim. According to Dwight Radcliffe, the prophetic witness of the Black church at its best can be a soul check, a model for the wider church. Martin Luther King said, "The church cannot be master or servant of the state, but the conscience of the state." Nations may succeed when Christians are in power, not Christianity. We must denounce the far right and the divisive flag, shrouded as a symbol of national identity and jingoism, echoing memories of hate. For me, it is not even about the mainstreaming of the far right or far left in Christianity. It is not choosing white supremacy or Black supremacy, but the supremacy of Christ. It is waving and living the banner of the kingdom values of faith, hope, and love, especially the greatest of these, the banner of love. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tomlin, for a very thought-provoking and provocative response to the question that we are exploring this evening. I want to thank all of our presenters for their contributions so far. If they all want to return to the screen, that would be great, because we have roughly 20 minutes for questions. So we're going to get straight into them. Thank you for those of you who have posted questions in the chat so far, and I'm going to go through some of them that relate to each. Well, I'm going to go through those that relate to the speakers who are here. So I want to start first of all with you, Aaron. One of the first questions that came in was in response to your presentation, and they asked the question, given this long and painful history, the entanglement of the far-right ideas with Christianity, do you believe the church is truly capable of learning from its past and ending the suffering it continues to inflict on its own believers? I wonder if you, I know you're not necessarily the theologian in residence here, Aaron, but I wonder if you want to take that, and then maybe Carol and also Chris might want to respond to that first question. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think one of my points about co-option or appropriation was the idea that what is authentic and what is not is a complex story. And colonialism and racism are embedded into that history in the hands and the mouths and the ideas of people. And that continues to be the way it is. I think the question there has to be an acceptance of that history and actually fighting against it as well. And I think that's really important, particularly in a context when you see the far right, and I would even say sort of more mainstream figures, not only embracing that aspect of the history, but actually denying it at the same time. And that's a complex thing to address. I think one of the things that I face, and if I could speak about myself, is as a Jewish person, I'm currently in a context where the sort of the heart and soul of Judaism is being struggled over. And me, myself, as a Jewish person who is anti-Zionist, who supports Palestinian liberation, have often been accused of not being Jewish enough, or really Jewish. So in a sense, that's partly why I stand a little bit back from the arguments about co-option and authenticity. But I think it's also really, really important to note that we're talking about two separate but intersecting things here. One is we're talking about defending Christianity. And the other, we're talking about defending the rights and the dignity and the lives of those who are at the sharp end of this racism and fascism. That's not that they're two absolutely separate things, but when we're talking about taking a stand against the far right, when we're in coalitions with diverse groups, the focus has to be those who are on the sharp end. And the debate around Christianity and what it means is also something that it has to be orientated towards the church and to those who co-opt. But I think that the target of this co-option has to be the priority at this moment.
Carol and Chris.
Okay, read the question again, please.
The question is, given the long and painful history, do you believe the church is capable, truly capable, of learning from its past, and then in the suffering it continues to inflict on its own believers? The idea that this entanglement, far-right discourse of Christianity goes way back, and I think the person who's posed this question suggests that actually we're not learning from the past, and what we're experiencing now is not necessarily new.
Yeah. Chris, over to you first.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carol. I mean, the one-word answer is yes. I have to believe, and I'm not being facetious here, but I have to believe that there is, at the very least, the possibility of learning and changing and beginning again. Otherwise, we might as well all pack up and go home. Slightly more extensive answer than that, I would say it's absolutely vital that we take seriously the collusion of the church with systemic injustice of all forms, including racialized injustice, for centuries. Absolutely. That's totally understood. Having said that, it's also the case that there has been an often marginalized or submerged tradition of radical liberative Christianity running alongside that institutionalized form of Christianity, a kind of an irritant to reactionary, a power hungry church. So I would say that there are 3 or 4 things that need to happen. First, borrowing from the work of people like Paulo Freire, we need, if we can listen, if we can learn, if we can wake up, become conscientized to the history and the structural injustice, then it does become possible to be converted, to become aware, to wake up to change. And I think when that happens, and we've seen historical examples of that happening, of change occurring, when we reach a tipping point and a new consciousness is brought to birth and a new vision of liberative living displaces old forms of oppression, then it does become possible to learn and be renewed, so long as that leads to systemic structural change. Now, I'm not saying any of that is easy, but if it was impossible, I think, as I said, we might as well all give up.
I don't know if you want to add to that, Carol, but maybe we could throw in another question which is related to this, which is one about practicalities. How can the church then reclaim this message? What kind of things need to actually happen for the message of love and enabling us to find ways of shaping our society, our societal change, shaping the society, and addressing the distortion that is often promoted by the far right? So you mentioned some practical things in both of your talks. I wonder if you want to underline some of these themes, Carol, where people are searching for what do we actually need to do in churches and in communities?
I think both Chris and Aaron actually touched upon it in terms of the consciousness raising. Cheryl Bridge-Johns, who's a Pentecostal scholar that I'm sure you're familiar with, Robert, talks about the consciousness raising. And she says that shouldn't be incompatible for us as Pentecostals. So I think it's critical that the church engages in critical dialogue because her and a number of other scholars talk about this critical dialoguing, which also can be really uncomfortable. But unless we're willing to engage critically, I'm reminded of William J. Seymour. You know, he's my hero. For those of you who don't know William J. Seymour, he is the African American preacher that kick-started modern day Pentecostalism at the turn of the 20th century. He was actually, what's the word? The catalyst for that whole movement was his engagement with the evening light saints. And this particular group, and remember, we're talking about post-slavery Jim Crow era. This particular group actually had Black and white and Hispanics all dialoguing in koinonia, in fellowship, table fellowship that we see in the biblical text. Remember, Paul critiqued Peter for his anti-Gentile stance. So I think that is so critical, having these critical conversations, which in many ways we're doing now. So
Thank you.
that has to be the starting point.
I wonder if you want to comment on this, Chris and Aaron, as well, this particular question about what needs to be done next, what kind of practical steps. I know you've mentioned them already in the discussion, but I guess some people who may have come in later may not have heard everything. So just to underline how we actually then counter this narrative.
I think it's a really important thing, and I think that both have highlighted the need for action, and I think that's really important because we need to create both dialogue and coalitions of solidarity and resistance to what's going on. And I think that was partly my final point about the way in which the fight against injustice from all our traditions, from all our standpoints, have to be articulated in a strong way. And it has to bring in not only people who feel passionately about this, but people on the sharp end of these things, and also people and institutions of power. And I think creating these coalitions, and I think there was a point earlier about the left fighting. And I think I do think, and I'm thinking as someone on the left, that it is important right now to create coalitions and to connect injustices and to connect people. And I think that's a starting point. And I think what we've seen over the past, particularly the past decade, since the beginning of the so-called migrant crisis and Brexit, is a further mainstreaming and emboldening of the right, and a further sort of like playing catch up. And I think it's important that action is taken.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a couple of questions that deal with issues around Christian nationalism and whether or not we need to separate these two discourses, and while acknowledging that nations have played a role in shaping Christianity, but see that as a really unhealthy and problematic binary. I mean, would you want to take that one, Chris, in terms of the whole idea of the way in which in sociology the separation of race and nation has been an important part of thinking about identities? Do we also need to do a similar thing in terms of Christianity and stop thinking in terms of nations? Or is it actually counterproductive because much of Christian history is about one nation?
A couple of initial reflections. I think on the one hand, we need to be honest. Whether we welcome it or like it or not is another matter. But I think we need to recognize the fact that historically Christianity, and particularly church with a capital C, has been intertwined with national powers and the nation state, and has been almost nationalized. I mean, we've got, for goodness sake, an example of that in England, certainly, with one particular Christian denomination actually technically part of the state, sitting in the House of Lords. So I think we need to recognize that relationship. Having said that, I just want to return to what I was trying to get at in my one of the things I was trying to get at in my reflection, that the for me, the fusion of an appeal to nationalism, and I speak very clearly as somebody who sees himself as an internationalist, the fusion of nationalism with an internationalist Christian gospel, for me, is a contradiction in terms. It's an aligning of a very particular culturalist reading of the Christian gospel as a form of teaching that is embedded in a dominant culture that affirms the values and the power relations of that dominant culture. It doesn't challenge the culture, but it affirms it. I want to be very clear. I believe that the teaching of Jesus, I believe that the preaching of the prophets, I believe that that Christian theology contradicts that completely. The very earliest Christian communities begin the emergence of what becomes known as the Catholic Church, with a kind of a small c, a kind of a universal church that cannot be imprisoned within kind of ethnic or national boundaries. We see examples of that in the ministry of Jesus. We see, on the one hand, Jesus foregrounding people from nations that were not part of the chosen people, the Samaritans, who become the heroes in many of his stories. But also, let's be honest, Jesus himself is told off by the Syrophoenician woman who says to Jesus, "Heal my daughter," and Jesus himself is imprisoned in an ethnocentric vision of his faith. He says, "No, you're not part of the people of Israel." She tells him off, and Jesus is awoken as a result of her prompting. So Christian nationalism, for me, it's a contradiction in terms. It's not something that we see within Christian history, but it is. It is something within Christian teaching, but it is something that we need to recognize as part of the political landscape. But it's a form of culturalism. It's a misappropriation of Christianity, and I don't know that the word Christian should be kind of tagged with nationalism ever. Sorry, I began to rant a bit there, but
that's okay. That's fine. That's really clear. Thank you very much for that. We're coming to a close now. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I just want to give you all 45 seconds just in closing to pull together what you've presented. Any final thoughts, any further reflections on any of the questions in terms of where we go from here. But let me just throw a question out that may help frame it in terms of your response. Are things likely to get better or worse? And depending on that answer, what do you want us all to do next? If we start with you, Aaron.
Right. Thank you very much. I really hope they do. And I think part of what I was trying to argue was the sort of the short recent history of the mainstreaming of the far right, a far right that kind of builds on existing inequalities and compounds them. And it compounds them not just because it's more extreme, but because the mainstream lets it in and lets it do that in ways that reaffirm the status quo. I think it's what has occurred has been a compromise with the extreme. It's been a constant saying, if we give them an inch, they won't take a mile. and we keep on giving into them. And it's made people afraid to challenge the ideas that have whitewashed them and allowed them to be that way. Saying, no, flags everywhere are not okay. No, it's not okay to strengthen the border to prevent more strengthening of the border, or the displacement of people to prevent more displacement. We're going to lock them away on barges so we don't deport them. That's not a compromise that is in any way acceptable. And I think that we have to stop compromising with them, and we have to start standing up to their use of symbols, but also being critical of those symbols and institutions. So we're a more conscious, reflective society that understands the contingency and the very troubled history of our religion, our religions, our institutions, our nation. And I do agree, we have to untether Christian from nationalism, and knowing both the nation and Christian nationalism are very recent phenomena. But at the same time, be very aware that the far right use of Christianity is also civilizational and colonial and imperialistic. And we have to keep our eye on that too.
Thank you. Chris, and then Carol.
I believe things can change, but I think we need to be honest and recognize that we're possibly again at the beginning of another struggle against the far right, and need to recognize that as things stand, I think, as several of us have implied, many of the views that we have been critiquing are actually present in churches from different Christian traditions. We need to recognize that there is a struggle to be had. But I'm confident, I'm optimistic that through collective action, through education, through supporting one another, through actually returning to those scriptures that remind us of the liberative power of God, that God is closer to those who are oppressed than to people like me. We can change. Change needs to come, and change needs to come soon, but it's going to be a struggle.
Thank you. And finally, CAROL TOMLIN.
The more things change, unfortunately, the more things remain the same. And I agree with what's been said. Christian nationalism, it's an oxymoron. It's incompatible. Nationalism and Christianity. And for me, the issue is, are Christians bold enough to be counter-cultural? And this is why I embedded my talk within the Christology of the kingdom message of Christ. I think it's important that we counterbalance what is actually happening now, because we will lose our credibility. It's, in fact, I think it's, for me, it's a very worrying trend which is emerging. And I think what is it CHRIS? CHRIS?
Yeah.
What CHRIS actually spoke about, the dichotomy of the right versus the left, and those who want a more traditional value system, which aligns more with the traditional orthodoxy. They've been lured by, unfortunately, the message of the far right agenda. But will things change? I'm not sure, and I have to hold up my hands, unless we have this critical dialoguing, and to end with Paul in Romans 12, our minds really need to be renewed so we can be transformed. And as Martin Luther King said, you know, nations may succeed or change when Christians are in power, but we certainly should not invoke a nationalistic agenda that smacks of fascism, and
Thank
that's
you very much.
problematic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tomlin. I want to close now by just saying thank you to our speakers again. If you can and want to show a virtual hand clap, please do. Dr. Erin Winter, Dr. CHRIS SHANNAHAN, Dr. KRISH KANDIAH, who presented a video message, and also Dr. CAROL TOMLIN. Thank you all for giving your time, your expertise and your enthusiasm this evening. And secondly, thank all of you who participated by signing up and being part of this event and also contributing in the chat. We hope to have more meetings like this where we can explore our current predicament in terms of Christianity, far-right discourse, and how we respond going along. So please do look out for future events that we'll be posting on online platforms. So thank you everybody once again, and good night.